So come have a seat here if you don't mind. Okay, welcome everyone to RUSI. I'm Karen von Hippel, the director here, and it's a huge pleasure to welcome all of you. Nancy Lindberg, our head of our cousin think tank in America, is here, and former High Commissioner Alexander Downer is also here. We are just back from Munich, so we're both a little bit fried. But it was a very interesting event because it was the largest U.S. congressional delegation to Munich ever. Something like 60 members of Congress went to Munich, and much of it was to convey a message that the U.S. Congress still cares about alliances, still cares about NATO, etc. It was a slight contrast to Vice President Pence's speech, if anyone had read that. But in any event, it'll be really great to hear more from Senator Coons, his thoughts on that. He's going to be talking today about the U.S. commitment in Syria and Afghanistan, but I think he will be wide-ranging and talk about U.S. foreign policy in general and alliances. And he wants to make sure he has plenty of time to answer questions, and he's very frank. And so please feel free to ask him any question. This is all on the record, the entire thing, the Q&A and the remarks that he makes at the start. And I think most of you know who Senator Coons is, but he is one of the most distinguished senators who is really an expert, in particular on Africa. He's visited over half of the countries on the continent. He's lived there when he was younger, but he's also a foreign policy expert. He serves on several different committees. I have to have a look. Yes, Appropriations, which is very important, as you all know, Judiciary, Foreign Relations, and the Ethics Committees in the Senate. So before I turn it over to him, let me just remind everyone to please turn your phones off. And if there is an emergency, please follow RUSI staff, who will direct you to the nearest exit. Thank you. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Karen. Thank you so much to this wonderful audience. Thank you for your introduction, for your top-notch work on counterterrorism at the State Department, for your fellowship at the Munich Security Conference, and for the chance to be with you today. I'd like to thank the Royal United Services Institute for, as an organization, your excellent analysis and work on defense and security issues, and I appreciate the work that Neil and the Institute staff have done to prepare for my visit to this intimidatingly beautiful and historic library. I'd also like to thank the U.S. Embassy staff here in London who've made this a remarkably productive and positive day, and to Tom Mancinelli, my incredibly capable foreign policy advisor, who has helped make sure that I've gotten some of this right. So to the extent any of this strikes you as right, the credit's to him. To the extent it's all ill-informed, superficial, and vague, that's all on me. As you just heard from Karen, we've just come from Munich, which was a striking opportunity to revisit the role of the United States in our alliances and in the world. There's been a fair amount of news today, and I'll give some brief opening remarks and then turn to the topic, which essentially is where are we headed in Syria and Afghanistan? What's the United States strategy, and where are we going together? But let me just start with what was the core assurance that I was attempting to deliver with so many of my colleagues in Munich and in several meetings today. The United States, in my view, has no better partner, no closer ally than the United Kingdom. And our shared history makes this clear. This coming June, we'll celebrate the 75th anniversary of D-Day, when soldiers of the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and our other allies stormed the beaches at Normandy in an important, pivotal moment in modern history. And in December, the United Kingdom will host the 70th anniversary of NATO, the most successful and enduring military alliance known. The challenges that we face in this century in the world, from transnational terrorism to nuclear nonproliferation, from climate change to global pandemics, require alliances and close partnerships built not just on interests or on client relationships, but on shared core values. And in these undertaking these challenges, the United States has no better partner than the United Kingdom. Since 9/11, when, as we all know, terrorists struck both the United States political capital and economic capital, the United Kingdom has faced its own tragic terrorist attacks, including the London bombings of July 7th, in which more than 50 died. More than 120 people have been killed in the UK in terrorist attacks since 2000, and so we are indeed in this fight together, the fight that launched our invasion of Afghanistan and has required our work in a dozen or more countries around the world. There's over 1,000 UK military personnel involved in the mission against ISIS in Syria and Iraq at this moment, and the Royal Air Force has conducted over 2,200 sorties. The UK has about 1,100 troops in Afghanistan right now, the third largest troop contributing country, and more than 450 have made the ultimate sacrifice since 2001. So we are in this fight together. We continue to stand shoulder to shoulder. You know the costs better than any of our allies, both about the struggle against terrorism and the ongoing sacrifices we must make in order to try and bring some end to our global conflict with terrorists. Since I was first elected to the United States Senate in 2010, I've worked hard to support our special relationship. I was in London this time last year when I met with the National Security Advisor and Foreign Secretary. And we discussed at the time our shared interests in cybersecurity, which has produced a now American law to permit executive agreements between governments and to permit streamlined procedures for law enforcement officials to access data held in the other's jurisdiction. And the first executive agreement under this law is underway between the United States and the United Kingdom, a testament to the trust and faith we have in each other. In a world where terrorists in Europe can use the internet to plot attacks in the United States or vice versa, partnerships like this are critical, welcome, and necessary. And an important part of my meetings today, which included the Ministry of Defense, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, was a visit to the National Cybersecurity Center to talk over some of the news-making assessments of the day, and frankly to learn from the robust model that the NCSC presents and from which I think the United States could learn. I continue to be grateful for the close friendship I have with Sir Kim Dara, your ambassador in the United States, and with other UK officials who have visited me. Those visits, bluntly, have become more frequent in the last 2 years since the election of our president has given us more than ever to talk about. I am concerned about the state of the Transatlantic alliance and determined to make sure that our relationship and our ties remain as close as possible despite the obvious current strains. As you heard in Karen's introduction, something like 60 members of Congress, close to 24 senators and 36 House members, voted with our feet and chose to attend the Munich Security Conference in the largest delegation of Americans ever in its 55-year history. And really our joint purpose was to demonstrate in person our commitment to the transatlantic relationship, to NATO, and to our special relationship with the United Kingdom. I appreciate the unique political forces on both sides of the Atlantic, the rise of populism and nationalism, to the distrust of institutions and the weariness towards foreign commitments. But that doesn't mean that we should abandon the goals that we have pursued together for 7 decades and that have produced security and prosperity for our people. Challenges from a weaker yet more aggressive and potentially lethal Russia to a broadly ascendant China underscore the importance of our shared values and this history that underlays the transatlantic alliance. NATO is a key institution that I continue to argue at home has served our interests better than any relationship or alliance we've ever had. I visited Estonia in 2016, where I heard from the Chief of Defense, who expressed his deep gratitude to the UK battalion that is part of the NATO Enhanced Forward Presence to give reassurance to his country about the significance of NATO. Look, more broadly, all the institutions that we've built together over 7 decades, not just NATO, but the IMF, the World Bank, the EU, all of these were done not out of some sense of charity, but out of a sense that this was the best way for us to secure our prosperity and our security together. Obviously, there are some voices in American leadership that characterize them differently, that suggest that somehow the EU is a competitor to the United States and that somehow NATO is the equivalent of a protection racket in which there's some unpaid bar tab that must be settled. My hope in our question and answer session is to suggest how we might move forward in a positive way on that. But let me just say that so as the Brexit process unfolds here, as our own domestic political challenges unfold at home, we've just concluded, as you know, I'm sure, a tumultuous government shutdown. I am determined that we will stay side by side and that whatever the people of Great Britain decide about Brexit and their relationship with the EU and whatever ends up being decided in the United States in terms of our security investments, we will keep working more closely together. One small indication of this is the caucus I've joined with Senator Rob Portman, Republican of Ohio, to indicate to the people in the government of the United Kingdom that if, on the other side of Brexit, you're prepared to negotiate an FTA, there's a bipartisan group of senators ready, willing, and able to do so. Let me just close this part of my comments by saying the time we spent together in Munich sharpened my focus on the ways in which we must consult with each other, respect each other, and work closely if we are to sustain this special relationship. So to the topic at hand for today, I strongly support a continued presence by United States troops on the ground in Syria and Afghanistan to retain the capacity to prevent groups like al-Qaeda and ISIS to establish physical strongholds and to launch again terrorist attacks against our nations. And I'm gravely concerned that an abrupt and precipitous withdrawal from either country threatens to erase the fragile and reversible gains and now the positive momentum that both UK and US troops have won together. We have fought hard to achieve progress, both military and civilian, over recent years, and I think we are literally on the precipice of positive steps forward in both countries, steps that we can lose if we abandon too abruptly the field of combat. While an era of great power competition seems to be returning to the world stage, and we have to together develop thoughtful strategies for dealing with Russia and China, the threat of international terrorism has not gone away. And despite the distractions of our domestic politics in both countries, and despite the rise of a populism that suggests we should withdraw from the world, I think this is exactly not the moment, and this is exactly not the way in which to do so. Is terrorism still a pressing threat? Some folks in my country question whether the greatest emergency is folks trying to transit our southern border as opposed to folks trying to attack us from abroad. Well, the UN Security Council issued a report in July that estimated the total current membership of ISIS in Iraq and Syria at between 20 and 30,000. And top terrorism experts estimate most of the 40,000 foreign fighters who traveled to Iraq and Syria since 2014 are still very much alive and well and motivated to commit acts of terrorism, whether there or against their countries of origin, and are widely dispersed throughout the region. Our Pentagon's Inspector General issued a report just a few weeks ago that said, and I quote, ISIS remains an active insurgent group throughout Iraq and Syria, and absent sustained counterterrorism pressure, ISIS will likely resurge in Syria within 6 to 12 months and regain territory. General Joseph Votel, the head of U.S. Central Command, agrees, and just a few days ago said that he is in line with where our intelligence community assessment is on this, and he also reinforced this conclusion that there are literally tens of thousands dispersed and disaggregated, but with potential leadership that might draw them back together in the event we leave a vacuum. The threat picture in Afghanistan is no less serious. A U.S. Department of Defense report from July of this past year says, and I quote, that Afghanistan faces a continuing threat from the highest regional concentration of terrorist groups in the world. Indeed, Afghanistan and its immediate neighbors are the home of al-Qaeda Corps, al-Qaeda on the Indian subcontinent, the Islamic State Khorasan, the Haqqani Network, and the Pakistani Taliban. So the threat of terrorism, I assert, remains strong, remains relevant, remains lethal. But even though the threat remains, the United States, the United Kingdom, and our international partners have made progress. Let's look at Syria over the last 4 years and Afghanistan over the last 18. In Syria, the policy to defeat ISIS that started under former President Obama and former Prime Minister Cameron and has continued up until just recent days has had an unheralded success, especially in northeastern Syria. The Syrian Democratic Forces, composed of both Kurdish and Arab fighters, has been a unique post-9/11 success story of a close partnership with local forces to fight and then hold territory taken back from extremist control. The citizens of Raqqa today are bringing their city back to life, reopening businesses, rebuilding schools, and recovering from the brutal governance of ISIS. The governance model of the Syrian Democratic Council, I will admit, is far from perfect, but it makes attempts at inclusive governance with both male and female heads of civic councils. If we turn our gaze to Afghanistan, the NATO Operation Resolute Support Mission has enjoyed progress and achieved some significant successes. I've got a lot of details here, but I'll cover it briefly. The Afghan economy has improved. The World Bank's estimate of doing business in any country on earth in 2019 ranked Afghanistan as the top improver. The government's collecting more domestic revenue. It's improving its ability to spend funds on things like healthcare and education. Electricity access has gone from virtually 0 to 85%. More of the Afghan people are accessing the modern world through banking by cell phone. The under-5 mortality rate's been cut in half since 2000, and the fight against polio has reached almost the most remote corners of the country. There's over 170 radio stations, hundreds of print media outlets, and dozens of television stations. I'm not saying that it is a garden or a Jeffersonian democracy. I'm simply suggesting that when it comes to gender equity, access to the basics of the modern world, there has been sustained and significant progress. One statistic I like is former Ambassador Ryan Crocker points out that when Taliban rule was forcibly ended, fewer than 1 million children in school, all of them boys. And within just a few years, there were 8 million students, 40% of them girls. That change in education has been sustained for the decade or more since and has led to significant changes in Afghan society. One of the most compelling meetings I had on my first trip to Afghanistan, literally on the roof of the American Embassy, was with a group of women parliamentarians who had played a role in redrafting the Constitution, who had literally risked their lives to stand for election in their home communities, and one with whom I spoke had just survived an assassination attempt the previous week. This was in 2011. If you think about how much has been sacrificed and how many risks people have taken in order to bring into being a different vision than the Taliban had for Afghan society, I don't think we should or would abruptly abandon them. Leaving abruptly and not putting in place either a military holding force or a diplomatic process that can guarantee some stabilization risks the Taliban regaining complete control of the country. And not only would the elected service of the trailblazing women I just referenced come to an end, but their lives would certainly be endangered. All these gains would be at risk if coalition forces and coalition support for the Afghan National Security Forces and the Syrian Democratic Forces, and if international foreign aid to Afghanistan and Syria are abruptly and precipitously withdrawn. A hasty and complete withdrawal, as recently proposed by our president in the United States, would threaten the military progress and the socioeconomic progress that the United States, the United Kingdom, and our partners have worked so hard and so long to obtain. So let me also say regionally, I think our withdrawal would encourage both Russia and Iran in Syria and leave civil strife and space for terrorist groups, and comparable withdrawal on a comparable timeline, which has not yet been proposed, but I fear is imminent, would have the same consequences in Afghanistan. Let me clarify one important point. I'm not saying that our troops should stay in Afghanistan or Syria forever. And I recognize widespread war weariness in both our nations, particularly with the mission in Afghanistan that has gone on nearly 2 decades. But the presence of U.S. and allied troops prevents safe havens for terrorists, strengthens the West's ability to negotiate a diplomatic agreement, and makes possible an enduring political solution. There is not a high likelihood of a clear-cut battlefield victory in either conflict. After so many years and so many lives, it is hard to credibly talk about winning in either Syria or Afghanistan. But we can lose, and we can lose decisively. We can lose credibility with our core allies and partners if our withdrawal is done without proper consultation and done abruptly. We can lose the gains we've managed to make on the ground and in the lives of the people of both Syria and Afghanistan. And we can critically lose the leverage to help ensure that the people of Syria and Afghanistan have a central role in shaping their future. So with all of this on the line, I think we should, and I'll briefly articulate this, set realistic goals in both theaters. In Afghanistan, our objective should first be to protect the West from a potential large-scale terrorist attack that originates in the territory of Afghanistan, which we can do by sustaining the Afghan government in Kabul and other major cities, by providing training, arms, and critical intelligence to Afghan forces to continue to carry out their fight against terrorists, and by stepping up diplomatic engagement throughout the region with a broader set of actors who ultimately have to buy into any solution. In Syria, we have to finish the job of ending the caliphate and helping create conditions so that they are not reborn under a different name. By some estimates, this will take at least 2 or 3 more months of clearing operations and then at least another year of holding operations to sustain the gains already made by our Kurdish and Arab allies on the ground. We need to protect those partners, the Syrian Democratic Forces, or face the very real possibility that local forces under comparable circumstances will never trust us to stand by them after victory on the ground again. And we have to combat Iranian influence. Syria cannot end up being the host country for a robust regional Iranian presence that directly threatens Jordan and Israel. So I think I've made it clear that I take issue with the substantive outcome of precipitous withdrawal, but also, more importantly, I object to the lack of any real process by which this decision was recently taken. The absence of any meaningful consultation, obviously with the Congress, offends my sense of the balance between our branches. But the absence of any real consultation with our closest and most vital ally, the United Kingdom, and with the dozens of other countries who have joined us in the fight against ISIS, and the absence of consultation with the Syrian Democratic Forces, gravely concerns me and suggests the real possibility that a comparable outcome may be soon in the offing in Afghanistan. We had the opportunity in Munich to meet with President Ashraf Ghani of Afghanistan, who, although cautiously supportive of the idea of initial diplomatic efforts between the Taliban and the United States, is gravely concerned that those not proceed past a critical point without the direct participation of the elected government of sovereign Afghanistan. If we aren't willing to coordinate with our closest allies and with our partners on the ground, it reinforces the notion, so forcefully stated by Angela Merkel, that the United States is not a reliable ally. And it frustrates me deeply to think that such behavior may cause our allies across Asia and Europe to wonder if they might be the next American partner to be abandoned. The United States can and should sustain a critical leadership role in the world, and rash decisions cast doubt on our willingness to sustain and deserve the mantle of leadership in world affairs that over 7 decades the UK and the United States have hammered out together. Let me take a step back for a moment and consider briefly some ways in which the Congress has asserted itself on foreign policy since our president took office, in order to give you some hope that there is some reason to think there might be some pushback from the Article 1, that's the section of the Constitution that establishes the Congress branch, against the Article 2 branch, that's the one that establishes the presidency. Congress has asserted itself as the president has acted in ways inconsistent with our interests and values. Let me give you one quick example. In the summer of 2017, the 100 United States senators voted by a margin of 98-2 to impose mandatory sanctions on Russian officials for their meddling in our 2016 presidential election. In the 2 consecutive fiscal years, Congress has across the board resoundingly rejected the president's proposals to slash our foreign assistance and State Department budgets by more than 1/3, which would have crippled our efforts internationally. In December just this past year, in back-to-back votes, Congress sharply criticized President Trump's response to the death of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi and signaled a lack of support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen and our role in sustaining it. And in just January 30th of this year, I joined 67, a critical number, of my Senate colleagues in voting to rebuke President Trump's decision to precipitously withdraw from either Syria or Afghanistan. While these actions, a resolution in particular, does not bind the executive branch, it is not insignificant that this is occurring in a branch of our legislature where the president's party enjoys a majority, in fact, a majority that grew after our midterm elections. In my mind, though, the Congress can and should do more. The January vote was a missed opportunity for our Senate to dig deeper and conduct a more thoughtful and informed debate about these ongoing conflicts, and to draw back to ourselves some of the power we have ceded to the executive branch over war-making since 2001. In both Syria and Afghanistan, we are forced to choose among suboptimal options, and I want to have frank discussions with my colleagues who disagree with the views I've presented here today, many of whom are campaigning to seek the presidency on the ticket of my party in 2020. We need, as a country, to have a robust debate about the best way to deal with international terrorism, not in an attempt to score political points as we approach our next national elections, but in order to develop an enduring strategy for our nation that our people can support, and for our Western partners and allies, so that all of us and all of our constituencies can believe in the mission and the purpose we are undertaking. Western governments also need to think more broadly about how we can prevent the next potential ISIS caliphate or the next al-Qaeda safe haven. The Sahel is home to a number of armed, lethal, and extremist groups from ISIS West Africa to Boko Haram. Kenya just suffered a terrorist attack last month as the Horn of Africa and East Africa wrestle with al-Shabaab based in Somalia. Yet another ISIS offshoot conducts attacks in the Philippines. In the face of such ongoing lethal attacks, we have to find a shared approach to how to act. Last Congress, I introduced bipartisan legislation to require a detailed U.S. strategy to help fragile states become more resilient before they become subject to shocks, whether from civil war, disease, climate change, or terrorism. And following an insightful report by the United States Institute of Peace, I will be reintroducing an improved version of this bipartisan bill to ensure the United States is making investments in foreign aid, in development, in diplomacy, and in defense in a targeted way across specific sectors of society to provide livelihood, to prevent to prevent terrorist recruiting. It may be hard to persuade our average voter in the United States or the United Kingdom that investments like this, that strategy like this, that pulls together defense, diplomacy, and development is the best way to prevent another tragedy, such as unfolded in the United States in 9/11 or here in London on 7/7. But we owe it to our people to develop policy-based, systemic approaches to get to the root causes of terrorism and to ensure that we have a positive path forward for our people and for the people of the developing world. In August of 2007, President George W. Bush, someone I don't often quote, summed up his strategy for defeating international extremists by saying, we'll fight them over there so we don't end up having to fight them here in the United States. That strategy remains largely correct to this day. And that line goes a long way towards summing up my argument. I would only stipulate that the we is not an American first or an American only we, but is a we that includes our most valued and closest allies, the United Kingdom and our NATO partners. As we continue a fight in Afghanistan and Syria that is critical so that we don't face internationally based terrorists in our home capitals, we need to stay closer than ever. We need to remain shoulder to shoulder, and we need to reinforce the values and the tactics that have underlain this hard and difficult work for so many years. I am grateful for the opportunity to lay this out. The time I've just spent in Munich and the conversations I've had with leaders from across Europe, the UK, and the world suggest it is more important than ever that we have this debate, that the United States articulate its vision going forward, and that we reach a joint view of the threats we face, the world we seek to continue shaping, and why we are on this journey together. I am grateful for the chance to present this to you, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask the first question, so I'll stay seated, and then I'll stand up to look for questions. Thank you so much, Senator Coons. That was really interesting and wide-ranging and reassuring, I think, to many people here in the room. I wanted to ask you about Syria in particular, though, because we're now in a situation where facts on the ground, basically, the Assad regime is basically won, but he hasn't really won, right? The war is not really over. There are 5 countries who have troops, the Russians, the Iranians, the United States, Israelis, and the Turks all have troops on the ground in Syria. And it's almost been a war of attrition. I don't think the regime itself is strong enough to control the entire territory, but given, in my view, the regime has lost its credibility, having displaced half the population and 500,000 people have been killed largely by the regime. The U.S. has basically, in the last few years, ceded leadership to the Russians and the Iranians on the peace process, and that's also pretty frightening. So what can Congress do to really help reinvigorate that role, reinvigorate the role of the UN? I mean, we heard in Munich from Gare Peterson, the new special representative of the Secretary General, who really, I think, has a chance to try to knock heads together. But given the facts on the ground, given the lack of interest on part of at least President Trump, I think his representative in the State Department is actually very good, Jim Jeffries. But what can be done, or what role can Congress play to really push the peace process back to where it needs to be, at least?
First, thank you, Karen. First, as I laid out, I think we have an imminent strategic mistake. So first, the role of Congress, I think, and this was the subject of a lot of discussion among the delegation I was a part of in Munich. is to do our very best to persuade our key allies to remain in a buffer zone between the Turks and the Kurds, and for the United States to retain control of Al-Tanf, a critical base that prevents Iranian forces from simply flowing into Syria in large numbers, and to make that case directly to our president, and to make the case to our core allies in the fight against ISIS in Syria that if we remain for some period, they should remain. There's real clarity that if the United States really follows its current path and has removed every soldier by April, our allies will not be there after April either, because of the critical force protection role that we play. My view is that sustained and effective counterterrorism remotely from Iraq or from other bases in the Gulf is not possible. Some might differ with that. So your question, how do we revive the peace process? First, we prevent the conditions on the ground from deteriorating so sharply that our SDF or Kurdish and Arab allies have to reach some sort of accommodation with Assad in order to survive an otherwise likely assault from Turkish forces. First. Second, by retaining control of the northern third of the country, including some critical oil fields, by retaining the ability to serve as a blocking force against Iranian engagement, and by being willing to proffer some investment in the reconstruction and rebuilding of Syria. The United States, the UK, and our other partners retain a seat at the table and have a chance, as fighting draws to a conclusion, to push for a resolution that makes possible a multi-ethnic, multi-faith, democratic future Syria. I think the Assad regime lacks all credibility whatsoever. On a moral basis, it is an obscenity that Assad has been allowed to remain in power, and I think the United States made an absolutely critical strategic error in not becoming more engaged in Syria earlier. I understand the reluctance of the previous administration, given the very widespread war weariness of our country, but my view all along was pay me now or pay me later, to use an American aphorism, that the ways in which Assad was behaving fully justified intervention in order to push him over before the Russians and the Iranians came in. Today, without the active support of Russian air power and technical assistance and Iranian forces on the ground, Assad would not control most of the country. But he has, brutally, in a grinding war of attrition, secured control of a majority of the country other than the third currently held by the SDF. To abandon the third currently held by the SDF and force those who fought alongside us to make a devil's bargain between two hostile forces, I think would have lasting consequences, not just on the ground in Syria, but regionally.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, we have a lot of experienced soldiers and people who have fought in Afghanistan and Iraq in the room. So let me just start out with Sir Michael. But can we have do we have a microphone or no microphone? Oh, we do have a microphone. Great. So if you don't mind introducing yourself too. Thank you very much.
Senator Fester, thank you very much indeed. I'm Mike Carlton-Smith, old soldier. Very impressive talk. I mean, one of the best I've heard in the 60 years I've been coming to RUSI. Can I say that it's marvelous to hear an American make the points, make the points that you made, given all that we otherwise hear from across the states. One of the things you said was that you were sure that Congress could and should do more. My question is, how confident are you that in a given situation it can and will do more?
Thank you. Do you want to take a few, or do you want to?
I'll take that one first, okay, and then a bunch of others. But thank you, Sir Michael. I appreciate your compliment. This is a moment, and I say this frequently, both to my colleagues and my constituents. About once in a generation, we have to not just talk about democracy, we have to actually fight for it. This is a moment where the fighting is not taking place on a landing beach or in the streets, but is literally taking place in a few votes by a few politicians who may well risk their re-election in order to assert that no one is above the law, that rule of law matters, and that the structure of our Constitution, which our founders crafted, which gives the Congress the power of spending and an essential role in foreign policy, must be defended. Unfortunately, at the same time, we have the collision of an ongoing federal investigation of President Trump and his likely attempt at re-election, and some of his most unpredictable and erratic decisions in foreign policy, making it even more sort of difficult or imminent or pressing for my Republican colleagues to cast decisive votes. One of the most enduring challenges of our time is that the vast majority of Republican voters remain committed to President Trump. So I recognize that my colleagues who hope to be reelected or to continue to serve face enormous pressures in their home states to support the president at all costs. But two of my closest friends in the 9 years I've served in the Senate were gentlemen, one from Tennessee named Bob Corker, who was chairman of Foreign Relations, and a senator from Arizona named Jeff Flake. Both of them saw their careers end because they publicly challenged the president. Both of them were seasoned, both of them were senior, both of them were very capable, and it's been a cautionary note for other colleagues that this is a moment when making a decision like this, choosing to publicly challenge the president and push back against these decisions has real consequences. But failing to do so has even greater consequences. The reason that the Democrats took back the House of Representatives in the 2018 election wasn't because we were all about fighting Donald Trump. We won 40 seats by focusing on the real issues that the average American wants us to focus on. So the challenge for some of my colleagues is to recognize that the partisan political tensions in our country are not all about pro or anti-Trump, but they are about meeting the real needs of middle America. And I do think history will judge kindly those who are willing to take big risks for both the opportunity to meet the needs of average Americans and for the moment to strike a blow that actually means they would have stood up for and fought for democracy. We don't know yet, I don't know yet, how many of them will be willing to do that when the moment comes. But in the private conversations I've had literally just in the last few days, they're talking a very tough game about this decision in Syria, about the possibility of some comparably abrupt and potentially catastrophic decision on the Korean Peninsula in the upcoming conference with Kim Jong-un, or about the possibility of an abandonment of Afghanistan without consultation. This will test them to their limits, but I suspect the president will give us plenty of opportunities to show our mettle and to demonstrate our commitment to democracy.
Okay. So the gentleman with the beret right there. Yeah. Who's got, oh, yeah, you could just pass it down the road. Yeah, it's coming to you. Yeah. Do you see?
All right.
Can you introduce yourself?
My name is Guevara Raul.
Hi, Guevara.
I'm a researcher. I'm actually doing my habilitation at the University of Hamburg. There is a very interesting issue that you've raised. I came a little bit late. But if you could hear what the Iranian foreign minister said yesterday, that the United States and Israel are the main source of crisis in the Middle East. And most European governments have concentrated mainly on the Israeli-Palestinian issue as the main crisis in the region. Is there any impression on your part that ignoring, for example, Arabs' occupation of North Africa, what we call Azania, the Arabs' colonial occupation of North Africa, within that very template of Israeli-Palestinian peace arrangements, is sort of like an apartheid peace process that has implications for the long run to come?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'll tell you that an Arab occupation of northern Africa does not strike me as something that is a current pressing cause of the tensions in Syria and Afghanistan or a causal factor for extremism that has led to terrorism. Obviously, let me just assert that I agree that finding a path towards resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian tensions of a long period now is an important part of pursuing peace. But I reject the assertion by the Iranian leadership, the current Iranian regime, that the principal cause of instability in the Middle East is Israel. And I'll suggest that there are reasons internal to Syria why Bashar al-Assad deserves our condemnation and why those who have fought both against him and against ISIS deserve our support. Thank you.
Okay, so here and then the gentleman in front of you. Yeah.
Senator Keir Simmons from NBC News. Could you talk a little bit more about back home, if you like? I suspect the timeline that President Trump is looking at most closely is the 2020 timeline, and the connection that you make between President Obama's administration and President Trump's administration, both in Syria and Afghanistan, those two policies were really united by an exhaustion on the part of the American people with intervention overseas and the amount of blood and treasure that's been spent. And I suppose one way to ask the question is, which of the Democratic candidates in 2020 do you believe will go to the election advocating that America stays in places like Afghanistan and Syria for the long term?
Well, let me answer the question indirectly and then directly. I know virtually all of the candidates in some way. Most of them seem to be from the United States Senate. So, you know, the good news, bad news is someone has to stay back and legislate. So I'll be busier in the next 18 months. I'm from the state of Delaware. There's this guy. He served in the United States Senate for 36 years. He served ably as vice president for 8 years. He knows virtually every world leader, not from watching them on television or going to one conference or not from being in the Senate for 2 years, but over decades. And he has seen leaders come, rise, and fall. He has seen policies be attempted and either succeed or fail. I don't think this is a great time for on-the-job training. I think that putting people in leadership who have literally never engaged in public service, either military or elected, has its limitations. And my hunch is that this is an election where if we advance our former Vice President Joe Biden as the candidate of my party, he is the one most likely to recognize, respect, and treasure the unique relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom, to understand and properly characterize why we worked so hard together to build NATO and the rules-based order, and why that contributes to American security and prosperity. I respect my colleagues who I've traveled with and worked with and legislated with. I'm not trying to disrespect any of them. I'll just tell you, in terms of getting it in his gut and being able to convey to the average middle American who perhaps can't find Syria on a map and doesn't want his son, niece, or cousin serving there, I think Joe Biden can make the case, and can make the case in a way that will win and will last. And I think if our current president continues to make strategic decisions that are abrupt and involve no consultation and that frankly aren't strategically wise, I think by the time we are facing elections in November 2020, there will be consequences, and consequences which we will have to confront and which we can then debate. But my dollar's on Joe Biden.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead.
Good evening. Dean Andrews from Counterterrorism Policing in the Eastern Region. Does the suggestion of US troop withdrawals potentially open a door to the likes of Eric Prince, formerly of Blackwater, and his Frontier Services Group to take over some of those services?
I hope not. You know, frankly, there are both legal, moral, and political reasons why soldiers should fight our wars rather than contractors. Many nations in world history have tried contract mercenaries. The Hessians were not particularly successful in the engagement that formed my nation. And I'll tell you that using contractors is a very unfortunate way to outsource what is one of the most fundamental obligations of citizenship and one of the most fundamental challenges of a sovereign nation, which is to be willing to send their own sons and daughters overseas to fight under the strictures of a legally authorized war, and with the oversight and accountability that comes from fighting in the armed forces. So I may be giving a longer answer than you wanted. I hope not, is my basic answer. And I think our president's enthusiasm for withdrawal isn't leaving open room to outsourcing the conflict in Afghanistan or Syria. I think he literally wants all Americans out as quickly as is possible. And I'm not going to support a sort of mid-range resolution that suggests that contracting out is in any way less expensive, less risky, or more appropriate. It's not.
Hokie Walker, member of the Institute. You mentioned a perceived threat from Iran. Iran is a singularly unpleasant state with an unhelpful separation of the powers, so that the judiciary behave in a most appalling way, whereas one could argue that the foreign affairs side is not too bad. It's a very weak state with a budget, military budget, far less than that of Saudi Arabia or Israel or the United States, and yet the United States seem to be obsessed with as an alleged threat. I suggest that the actions of Iran in the foreign policy field could all be explained on the basis of a weak state trying to establish what it can in the way of defense in depth. Do you think the threat really is real?
I do. Rather than pick apart any specific piece of your characterization, given you are far more seasoned than I am in these matters, let me simply say that sometimes a state that is much weaker can be more dangerous because they can choose to find ways to assert their either self-defense or their regional role through asymmetric attacks. I recognize that, for example, in naval forces, they are dramatically less capable than the UK or the US, but that has led them to develop a series of tools and techniques in terms of naval warfare that are no less dangerous just because they are not as expensive or as technologically sophisticated. I do think that they have supported regional actors from the Houthis to Hamas to Hezbollah that are destabilizing, and they have planned and executed terrorist attacks in other countries around the world. I happen to have a different view of the JCPOA than President Trump. I supported what was a very hard-won framework agreement between the United States, the UK, Germany, France, Russia, China, and the Islamic Republic of Iran in terms of intrusive inspections, clear supervision, and an abandonment of their nuclear enrichment efforts. I would have preferred that we continue to work within that framework, yet pay tougher and stricter attention to their missile program and to some of the ways in which they were proliferating missile technology. I don't take Iran lightly. I think they are quite dangerous. But I don't think they have the kind of capability to project military force and power throughout the world that an ascendant China does, that a weakened but very lethal and dangerous Russia does. And I thought we were on a path towards containing and managing that threat. It's my hope that the United States will rejoin a multilateral effort to work with our European allies to manage and contain the threat that Iran poses or could pose to Israel, to the United States, and to our European partners.
Skander Kane, CT Group. Relevant to discussions on Syria and Afghanistan, but also others. Just been wondering, how do you think the UK could be more effective at lobbying President Trump on many of these questions on the Middle East? I know it was a question here around the JCPOA, as there were debates about whether ministers should be going and trying to engage directly, or whether it should be members of our parliament going to speak to congressmen, and that was a more effective way. And from your side of the pond, what British efforts do you think are effective or ineffective? Great question.
Since I'm struggling with discerning what is the most effective means for a currently sitting senator to lobby my own president, I'm not sure that I've got great wisdom or insights on this. I will say that hearing directly from head of government, directly from the most senior elected leaders and folks who are leaders in security and intelligence may help. But frankly, we are swimming upstream against something that our president believes he's promised our people in an election. And for better or worse, one of his, from the perspective of an elected politician, one of his more admirable qualities is a determination, an unyielding determination to deliver on campaign promises, even if unreasonable, even if you can argue they were not believable in the first place. I don't think the average American actually believed that Mexico was going to pay for a concrete wall all the way from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific. And I argued, actually, directly, that constructing a few dozen more miles of border fencing could fulfill the commitment to secure our border, and working in partnership with Democrats to deliver billions of dollars more investment in technological efforts to secure our border through drones and surveillance and so forth, and enhanced personnel, really would have met what was the essence of a campaign pledge. Nobody thought Mexico was going, well, who knows what was in the mind of our voters. All of us have recently had a little dip in the bath of populism and nationalism, and sometimes things that are the easiest to articulate are the hardest to deliver or the least wise to embark on. So what will persuade President Trump? I think if there was clarity about a timeline on which all of us were agreeing, we would withdraw or draw down from Syria, but that timeline was not 2 months, might help move the needle. Having conversations, mill to mill, IC to IC, and then elected leader to elected leader that says we've got sort of door number 1, door number 2, and door number 3, to use again an American aphorism. And door number 1, which is the one we're barreling through alone right now, is the least positive, suggesting in a tweet that we might support the release of 800 European citizen foreign fighters who are currently in the custody of the SDF because they are lethal terrorists, or let's just take for the sake of argument that many of them would make unpleasant neighbors. That's not the action of a reliable ally. And so there are consequences to what we do in Syria that will echo and last. And the promises made by a president of the United States aren't just promises to the American people. They're also promises to those who have served and fought and struggled alongside us for decades. And our core problem is a president who thinks alliances make us weak, and that the alliances that have produced our prosperity and security have in fact enfeebled us and made us less successful and strong. So on some level, we're pushing against a core gut belief that he has. I'm not convinced that the popular electoral majorities that put him in office share that same belief. I'm not convinced of it. But if he is convinced of it, then almost no lobbying will change this path.
Okay, Nancy, please, and then Tony. Yeah. Great.
Yeah, let me find a way to be more hopeful in the next sentence.
Right behind you, Nancy. Yeah.
Hi, Nancy Lindborg with U.S. Institute of Peace. And first of all, thank you, Senator Coons, as an American, for continuing to be such a voice of reason. It's very encouraging. So I want to follow on to this question that you just answered. And you talked about the frayed alliances, about the abrupt withdrawal from Syria, leaving behind allies who are really endangered. Do you see Congress taking additional action in light of what you just said and in light of the Senators Flake and Corker examples, such that we can repair the frayed truss and do anything that might be veto-proof? I mean, do you anticipate that there might be actions that could draw down some of the pain of what is happening with our alliances?
Am I convinced that a Republican majority would override a presidential veto? No, I'm not. I'm very skeptical that in the end, when push comes to shove, if President Trump is determined to do this, I am not convinced that the Republican majority in the Senate will force a confrontation and override a veto. That's how you phrased the question. But that's partly why I cited the example of a vote where the president said, we shouldn't impose sanctions on Russia. This bill is a terrible idea. You move this bill through the Senate, I will veto it. And it passed 98-2. And it's law. He dragged his feet. He neglected its enforcement. He was slow to take action, but we pushed and pushed and pushed. And the sanctions are in place and actions have been taken. So it is not impossible. I'll remind all of us that Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis resigned in forceful vocal and public protest over this action. I thought that would be earth-shattering because he commanded uniform respect. The topic changed the next week and we moved on because the fight over the wall versus fence and the government shutdown was more riveting, more imminent, more important. Part of what I'm trying to do, and a dozen of my colleagues, is to remind us as a nation that that was a huge message. This enormously respected Secretary of Defense resigns in protest. That should be an early warning that this is not a great idea. But if forced into a corner where a majority of Republican voters still support the president at all costs, I am not convinced that the Republican majority in the Senate would override a veto. This is a moment where Mitch McConnell's leadership is essential. You would not have seen the votes in recent weeks condemning the president's abrupt actions in Syria or Afghanistan without Majority Leader McConnell's express endorsement. And in a conversation I had with President Trump just last week, he was puzzling over what does this mean? I think the message was blindingly clear, but it is hard for him to hear because it runs so counter to what he is convinced the American people want. So part of the challenge is for the American people, not just through their elected officials, but directly, to mobilize and speak up on this. That's why I'm so concerned that a few candidates of my party are seizing this opportunity and saying, get out of Syria. Hell, let's get out of everywhere. Let's bring everybody home. Why do we need troops in Germany? Why do we need troops in South Korea? Why do we need... This is not a strong or majority voice. But there are folks who have long wanted the United States to withdraw from the world. It's a terrible idea and will have terrible consequences. So to the extent I have anything to say about it, I will keep urging those who actually have the ability to persuade the president to do so.
Okay, now from a former soldier in Afghanistan.
Sailor. Senator Tony Johnson, an old sailor. Can we talk about Russia? Ghastly. But you did a brilliant articulation, if I may, of the future Syria in a collaborative vision. Now, where does Russia sit in all this? Do you see Russia as being part of that collaboration in terms of articulating the future, or is that a wish beyond our imaginations?
Well, I guess I'll once again say that's sort of a good news, bad news story. President Trump believes he enjoys a close relationship with Vladimir Putin, the ability to see into each other's souls and craft a more positive vision. I don't have the same optimism about the direction of Vladimir Putin's either spiritual life or political or economic or military ambitions. And I frankly think that as the economy of Russia faces greater headwinds, because it is essentially an extractive mineral resources economy at this point, and as the sanctions imposed by the West as a result of his unjustified invasion and occupation of Crimea and ongoing adventurism in the Donbass, as all of that continues to put pressure on him, he's demonstrating to his people that he is determined to restore the glory of Mother Russia and a shadow of its former Soviet empire. I personally misjudged how sustained Russia's engagement would be in Syria. I personally had guessed that they would not be spending as much time and effort, material, and that they frankly would be willing to reach some accommodation earlier than now, where they would largely push the Iranians out, sort of retreat to a enclave, say these are the bases we really care about, and other than that, the heck with the rest of it. That's not at all what's happening. In fact, if anything, they're pressing farther. There's renewed Russian interest across the continent of Africa. There's renewed engagement pressing on Afghanistan. And so is there a chance the Russians end up deciding to come to the table and be constructive in some end state in Syria? Like President Trump, President Putin is unpredictable, and he has played boldly and, from his perspective, successfully, a very weak hand. He has made record investments in military modernization, and he has inserted himself in places and in situations that many of us had concluded were permanently off the table. So there is a chance that President Trump will engage in some bold act of diplomacy and reach a resolution to Syria with Russian leadership that I can't foresee. It is possible that Kim Jong-un will, sort of unilaterally hand over his nuclear arsenal without any meaningful concessions by the United States as well. It's possible that the Tooth Fairy will be giving me $1 next week for my latest wiggly tooth. But I don't really expect that. And I don't really think that it is in either Putin's personal interest or Russia's strategic interest for them to give an inch in terms of allowing a more stable and settled Syria. I think they're in for a dime, they're in for $1, is an American saying, and I think they are going to stand behind Assad and an Iranian presence way beyond our current leadership, way beyond the patience and persistence and engagement of the American people and its elected leadership. So I frankly think we will see the reassertion of a Russian role in the Middle East for years to come.
Okay, the last question goes to the former Foreign Minister of Australia and the former High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, Alexander.
Senator, I was involved in my country, in Australia, in sending troops abroad for various missions, some of which you've been talking about this evening. And I think our experience in dealing with the public is that the public will support these operations if you make it clear to them you have an end game in mind. Right. Not a time-based withdrawal of troops, but a politically based withdrawal of troops. By that I mean a negotiated, you'll withdraw your troops, say, from Afghanistan, right, if there can be a negotiated settlement. So it seems to me the United States does have or has had a strategy on Afghanistan, which is discussions with the Taliban, sometimes sort of sotto voce, but discussions with the Taliban with a view to a negotiated political settlement, and in those circumstances tell the Taliban that the United States could consider, or the coalition could consider, withdrawing troops. But my question relates to Syria. I mean, you can criticise Trump, but I have to say a fair bit of criticism should be directed to his predecessor as well, because it's never seemed to me clear what the United States' objective in Syria was. And given that Assad and the Russians, and you've just made the point quite rightly, have pretty much got the show, they haven't nailed it, but they pretty much got the show under control. Isn't it hard to explain to the American people what you're doing in Syria, and what is the US strategy in Syria? What is your plan? I mean, what is the end game that the United States, are trying to achieve? And if you don't get there, doesn't that make you look weak?
So I think there is criticism aplenty that has gone around to the previous administration. There's a couple of different decision points we could go back and re-examine. But I'll say the one where I most vigorously disagreed was that great powers can't bluff. Great nations can't draw red lines or draw lines in the sand and say, if you do this, we will act, and then fail to do so, even if that line might have been drawn improvidently or the consequences might not be obviously good or bad. So I disagreed with a strategic choice to stay out of Syria at a moment when Assad was quite weak, when the domestic opposition seemed steadily ascendant, and where Russia had not made the decision to intervene, and where Iranian forces were not widespread and propping up the government. I'm just revisiting that because you know this better than I do, but the strategic situation was different. Once ISIS emerged, took territory, and rolled across not just a third of Syria, but a third of Iraq as well, President Obama saw the direct threat to all of our nations, and I think did the right thing in assembling a multilateral coalition. What I'm being critical about is, so what is your goal? First, to actually complete that mission fully and honorably. Honorably means not abandoning our allies in Europe, who we invited to join us in this and who stepped forward and joined us and who have fought, and to not completely and abruptly abandon the Kurdish and Arab partners who fought alongside us. The SDF and its members did not imagine that they would all be aligned with the United States for 50 years. I don't think this was that sort of fight. But to be handed over with no consultation or notice, completely abruptly, to an aggressive Turkey or an aggressive Russian and Iranian partner, I think will leave lasting negative impressions about what happens to local fighting forces when they align themselves with the United States. I think that has strategic consequences. And although in conversations I've had at the Ministry of Defense here and with leaders in Munich, our allies have been remarkably polite about it. I don't think abruptly abandoning the field and having no path out that allows us to stabilize and secure what we can in Syria is a wise choice. So you heard me criticize the abruptness and the lack of consultation. That's process. What you're really asking about is substance. There is a difference between some in the United States who want us to remain in Syria almost indefinitely to block Iranian aggression, and some who want us to simply finish as best we can the work against ISIS to prevent its almost immediate reemergence, and the then strong likelihood that we would have to re-engage. And a codicil on that, if I could. Our hold in Iraq is, I think, tentative at this point. And if the way in which we leave Syria leaves such difficult and open questions, I think the voices within Iraq that are militating for an American withdrawal will get louder. And I think the political case in the United States for an abrupt withdrawal from Iraq will also get stronger. If we're talking about a future in which the United States and its closest partners have no presence on the ground in Syria and Iraq, I think we're suddenly looking at a regional ascendant Iran with consequences that we ought to take quite seriously. And I think the likelihood that in that scenario, a next American administration is back in this region, but at great expense, without reliable local partners, and quite possibly on our own, is higher than I'm comfortable with. So can I articulate for you a concise case of why we stay, not indefinitely, but holding some of the territory that we have fought for and won in Syria and Iraq until we can reach a more stable political settlement in Syria and Iraq, and at that point withdraw our forces? I think I can make that case. I hope I just did. And frankly, if I can't, and I can't persuade my colleagues and my constituents, then we'll be dealing with a quite different security situation in the Middle East for a long time to come.
Well, Senator Coons, thank you so much. Really wide-ranging, thoughtful. I think you reassured enough people in this country that there are some sane Americans, if I could say that. But really, thank you all for staying, and thank you so much for your comments tonight. Please join me in thanking Senator Coons.
Thank you very much.